Hi, I'm Dave Vickers and welcome to Photo Show. In recent episodes we've been taking a look at the exposure triangle and explaining how photography is about controlling light to record an image on the sensor of your camera. In the first episode we were looking at shutter speed and explaining how shutter speed is used to control movement within your images. In the second episode we looked at aperture and explained how aperture is used to control the depth of field within your image and how much of your image is in focus from the front to the back. In this episode, I want to finish off the exposure triangle by explaining ISO, and then we'll start to look at how you put these things together to make the correct exposure for the photographs you want to take. Okay, let's look at ISO. ISO is the measurement of how sensitive your camera sensor is to light. It has various settings. On most cameras they range from about 100 ISO going all the way through up into the thousands of ISO. Now, the lower the ISO number, the less sensitive to light the sensor is. So if you're outside in bright sunlight, you'll use a lower ISO, like 100 or 200 ISO, to record the image. If you're in lower light, you'll increase the ISO, up as high as you like, to record the image on your sensor. The one downside of this is, the higher the ISO, the more noise you'll get into your image. So the better quality images will be at the lower ISO end. So the general rule of thumb is to try and keep the ISO as low as possible. Okay, that's explained ISO. So how do we start to put all these things together to get the correct exposure in your camera? Now, it's all about the balance of your shutter speed and your aperture together to allow the correct amount of light to reach the sensor to record an image. If you allow too much light to reach the sensor, your image will be too bright and what's called overexposed, like this. If you don't allow enough light to reach the sensor, your image will be too dark and underexposed, like this. So what we're looking for here is a balance between the two. If you imagine exposure to be like a set of scales, with your ISO as the center point and either side is your shutter speed and your aperture, we're looking for them to be perfectly balanced. If you change something, let's say you want to freeze the action, so you increase your shutter speed, your exposure is now out of balance. So you have to compensate for that by opening up your aperture by one stop to balance it back up again. Let's say the other way round, you want to shoot something with a shorter depth of field, so you open up your aperture, which is now thrown your exposure out of balance. You have to increase your shutter speed to bring it back into balance. Now if you look through your camera, in the bottom you should see a meter something like this. And this is your exposure meter. And what you're looking for is to get the marker on the center point of your exposure meter. If it's going towards the minus point, your image is going to be too dark. If it's going towards the plus point, your image is going to be too bright. Let's have a look at that meter on a real camera, and that should explain things a little bit clearer.
So this is the exposure meter on a real camera. I'm looking at the top screen because we can't see inside, and we're looking at this scale here with the plus, the 0 and the minus on it. Now you can see the pointer is dead on the 0 there, meaning we're on the correct exposure. And for this set of conditions we're looking at a shutter speed of 1/125th of a second and an f-stop of 5.6. If I now start to decrease the shutter speed, you can see the pointer's heading towards the plus side, which would overexpose the image. To compensate for that, if I start to close down the f-stops to there, now we're back to the center, and that would be a balanced exposure. Let's go the other way and increase the shutter speed, and there you can see it's heading towards the minus side, which would underexpose the image. To compensate for that, we open up the f-stop to bring it back down to the center for a balanced exposure. And that's what you're looking for in the exposure meter, to get it in that center, not towards the plus side or the minus side.
Okay, so now we've seen on the exposure meter in the camera, if you're in the center point, you've got a balanced exposure. And the way this works is because each time you increase or decrease your shutter speed by one increment, you're effectively halving or doubling the amount of light that reaches the sensor. And the same goes with your aperture. Each time you open or close your aperture by one increment, you are halving or doubling the amount of light that reaches the sensor. So between the two, you can balance out to get a correct exposure. And there's no such thing as the correct exposure values for any one photograph. There'll be a series of them. Let's say, for example, your camera is set at 60th of a second at f8, and that's your balanced exposure. And if you want to increase your shutter speed to 125 of a second, you're now going to have to open up your aperture to 5.6 to balance that out. Let's go the other way. Let's say you want to slow your shutter speed down to a 30th. You're now going to have to close your aperture down by 2 stops below that to balance it back out again. So there's no such thing as one set of exposure values. There'll be a series of equivalent values that all give a balanced exposure, depending on whether you want to freeze your action, create a different depth of field. All of these things come together to create a correct exposure. Hopefully that's explained exposure better. If you've got any questions, leave them in the comments box below and I'll get back to you. I'm Dave Vickers. Thanks for watching. See you next time.